everyone. Welcome to this virtual meetup. We're going to be talking about a C-suite perspective and bridging the gap between legacy applications and new technologies. I'm Lynn, the founder and chief editor at Healthcare IT Today. Excited to be facilitating this discussion. And, we love these to be a real discussion, and we thank everyone for attending live. If you are attending live, we'd love to have your questions as well. I mean, our goal is to answer your questions, to bring some insights and perspectives that maybe you haven't thought about, to help you flesh through this challenging topic that I think we all face. So if you have any questions, feel free to submit them into the Q&A section here on Zoom, and we'll do our best to incorporate those questions as well. Also, if you're following along on Twitter, you can use the hashtag HITSM. That's our health IT community at Healthcare IT Today. And I know the number of people will be live tweeting on that. So be sure to check that out. And also, I have to give a big thank you to Dell Technologies for sponsoring this meetup and hosting us. So feel free to mention them as well. And they have a hashtag TransformHIT. So check out some of the content they're sharing there as well on Twitter. So I think that's all the housekeeping before we begin. But today's topic is really an important one. Last night I was talking with a CMIO at a pretty large hospital organization. And as I was talking to him, he said to me, John, how are we going to do this? How are we going to afford to do what we need to do and all the IT projects that we need to do? And how do we do it at the scale that they're asking me to do it with the people? Basically, you could see, in his comment that he was suffering through just the number of applications, the number of IT projects that he'd been given from both a budgetary standpoint and a bandwidth standpoint of people. And so hopefully that, is the discussion today, is how can we better manage this approach to these, both legacy applications that we've accrued over time, but also still incorporating new technologies and not falling behind on the new technologies that could benefit our patients. So as that intro, I want to introduce our panelists. First, let's start off. Dr. Lahr, would you start?
Sure, happy to be here. Thanks for having me. Stephanie Lahr, I'm the CIO and CMIO at Monument Health, based out of Rapid City, South Dakota. We are a not-for-profit healthcare system, and we serve all of Western South Dakota, some of Eastern Wyoming, and Northern Nebraska. Definitely can relate to this conversation around this combination of legacy and current tech. And I think there's a lot of great things that we can talk through today, because it's about balance, right? We're going to have to find balance. Legacy shouldn't be a bad word. And yet we do need to be moving forward as well. So looking forward to what we can share today.
Yeah, great to have you here, Stephanie. Shahid, do you want to go next?
Sure, thanks. Hi, I'm Shahid. I'm a software engineer by trade, and most of my last 30 years or so has been in building large-scale systems, mostly in healthcare and government, but in a variety of other sectors as well. Currently, I'm the founder and publisher at Medigy.com, where we basically create educational as well as buyer selection tools for modern innovators. So, for example, if people are selling or building tools to hospitals and health systems, and they're not quite sure how to do a selection of tools and technologies for a small hospital versus a large hospital, those are the kind of things that we write about, make videos about, make podcasts about, to help complex buyers like Stephanie choose the things that they are looking for. And I love this topic as well, because two things come to mind when I think of legacy, and one is an anecdote by an old colleague of mine. I can't remember exactly where he said it, but he differentiated between legacy apps and what he called cherished apps. So some apps are legacy in the sense of nobody cares about them. They're just using them because they're just around. Others are cherished and they're loved, and they need to be kept and maintained for a long period of time. So that's one subject area. And the second one is what Stephanie just mentioned, which is how do you compute the balance and say, where do we spend most of our new money in versus some of our older money in? So I'm looking forward to this conversation to learn from both Jeffrey and Stephanie, as well as you, John.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a challenge is when two people cherish that old legacy app, right? I've had that experience.
Yeah.
But thanks, Shahid. Jeffrey, will you introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. My name is Jeffrey Tang. I most recently joined Dell Technologies as their CTO healthcare in America. And it's been a fun run. And my background actually comes from the engineering aspect of Silicon Valley. And about last 12 years I spent inside the healthcare area. And most recently was a healthcare organization down in the San Francisco Bay Area, serving like Stephanie, a nonprofit serving population of the county government of about 1.1 million people. And it was a great experience because we did not only the healthcare aspect, but being able to provide and understanding government regulations and the difficulties of what red tape can provide when it comes to applications and bring new things in as well. So when I think of legacy, it was very interesting. Shahid brought up, what's cherished or what's not, and it conforms to the mind of, it depends who's running it, right, and how important it is for them. Because some organizations, it might not even be part of the strategy. They might say, this is not critical, but for some instances, it is a critical aspect to possibly one business unit or a very important person within that business unit to have a lot of weight, right? So a fine balance, like Dr. Stephanie said, is really critical. How do we go about moving forward? And at the same time, so you're teeter-tottering on this edge, this knife's edge, and at the same time, you're kind of blown away by what costs associated with it to keep it is. So definitely looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah. Great to have you all here. So, I mean, we've kind of already started this conversation, but maybe Shahid, you could dive in a little more about, why do those legacy applications matter to the organization or end user, and then I think we'll hit, Stephanie's comments about, okay, how do we balance that, right? But so let's first understand, like, why do they matter so much? I mean, why do they stick around so long?
Yeah, so we'll look at it in a few different facets. One is the almost like the legacy organizational facet. So any application in which there is an older IT team that wants to be centralized, legacy means much more to that group than to a modern, in a more shadowed IT-driven model or a cloud-based model where each individual can decide for themselves what they would like to use. So this is relatively new. 10 years ago, we wouldn't have even had this discussion. Everything would have been managed by IT, and there would not be any direct connection to applications. That has changed somewhat, not dramatically, but it has changed enough to where you can say, okay, if an application is not managed centrally by IT, other than maybe single sign-on and those kind of things, those should not be considered legacy at all, right? Let the self-service users handle, manage it, and do it all on their own. Don't even get involved. In a centrally managed IT environment, the way to think about legacy is, if you were going to buy more of the same, would you purchase this again right now? So, for example, many of our listeners are using Epic, they're using Cerner, and if they were to buy again next year, the year after that, they would buy more seats without giving it a second thought. Like, they would not go into an evaluation effort. They would just say, I'm just going to buy more seats of whichever my applications are. Those should not be considered legacy. Legacy almost are those areas of applications which are in even minimal use, but let's say in reasonable use, but somewhere where you are not looking to make any more investments in terms of newer hardware, newer licenses and seats. And so you're trying to sunset them, but there's people cherished. It's cherished by somebody and being held on to it. So one thing to talk about during this conversation today for the audience, and definitely ask questions, is what does the non-centralized IT environment do for self-service of apps? And does this idea of legacy even matter in a self-service IT universe? And in the non-self-service IT universe, the centralized model that has been mostly popular in hospitals and health systems over the last few decades, how can we differentiate where we invest more in terms of buying more without giving it a second thought, versus if you have to give it a second thought about adding more investment next year versus this year, if you're thinking about the budget, you're dealing with a legacy app, right? Because that's an easy way to make a clean distinction. But these nomenclatures and how you carve this out is very, very important, because when you go get money for your budget, you want to make sure that everything you're buying is something you want to buy or not, and not are being forced to buy.
Well, I think there's two nuances, to what you said. The shadow IT one that you kind of led with, I think one challenge there is that shadow IT often then gets pushed to IT, right? So it starts as shadow IT, and then they realize, oh, wait, we can't support this. We shouldn't support it. Or a leader says, we don't want you supporting it. And so it gets forced upon IT. So I think that's one little nuance that I think is probably important to discuss as well. And then I think the other one is, you talk about a legacy system is one that is no longer, there's no replacement for it. But I think what happens a lot of times is there's a legacy system where you bought another solution. Communications is a great area, right? Okay, well, the new secure text does what that legacy system does, but we haven't quite adopted it. So it makes it even more complex than that. Stephanie, anything you'd add to this kind of framework of understanding these legacy applications?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in a conversation like this, it probably is always good to start off with a bit of a discussion around definitions and how we're thinking and using that word legacy. Because I sort of think of it as a little bit different. And I guess that's part of the reason I led with it doesn't have to be a bad thing. Legacy doesn't have to be, and I think that is becoming more of a concept as people are like, oh, you're using a legacy, whatever. And that comes with a connotation of either you're old school or it's a terrible tool or it's bad in some way. And, in my mind, legacy, it certainly may mean that it's been around a while and perhaps isn't getting the newest, latest, and greatest in development. The company that provides it to you may have moved on to new platforms or is developing new things. It may not be supported in the exact same way that it used to be, but there are a lot of times that it's working just fine. It was identified for something, as a specific need. It's plugging along. It's doing what it needs to do. The reality is, as you mentioned from your conversation with your with the CMIO last night, we can't pull out everything we have and replace it with something new every few years. And honestly, legacy things can become legacy much more quickly in this day and age than they've ever been able to become legacy before, right? You used to think about, well, if you've got a mainframe, that's legacy. I mean, seriously, now we aren't even talking about that. Like we move up one operating system and now you got a whole bunch of stuff that's sort of outdated and old, and you could probably put in the category of legacy because at a minimum, it's not being supported in the same way that it used to. It's not using the most current technology. It may then provide with it some additional security risks or functionality, kinds of things. But I don't think legacy is inherently bad. And so I think really it's the question of trying to figure out, hey, if you have applications, if you've got technologies that categorize as legacy from the standpoint of based on older technology, older platforms, newer things have come out to replace it, but you still are using and owning and whatever, then it's a real question from the business need around, well, do we need to bring this into, the future, and do we need to replace it? Through lots of orchestration layer stuff now, there's opportunities to be able to take stuff that's legacy and old and tie it to newer things so that maybe you can get the best of both worlds, that you didn't have to fully rip and replace that legacy system and you can keep some of what was working well about it, but maybe bridge it to newer technology so that you can get the best out of it. But yeah, I think for me, and on the flip side, when I think about, Shahid's comments about shadow IT and those kinds of things, those are honestly applications we've seen departments go off and buy things for years that those become some of our legacy applications, right? Nutrition might be using some old school, nutrition system that now they want to tie to the the new EHR that we just put in or whatever. And it's like, well, just because it's old doesn't mean that we may not need to do it. But what we might find if they've been managing it all along is it's 15 updates behind. And now we have to address, whether or not we can get it updated and brought together. But again, I just, as healthcare provider organizations who have limited resources and ridiculously large appetites for technology right now, we've got to be making really solid decisions and have really good business drivers for why we're going to move off of something. It can't just be, well, it's legacy and, legacy equals loser, move on to something new.
What a great perspective. Thanks. Jeffrey, anything you'd add? And maybe let's take the conversation a step further around, what's the correct process to know when should I move on from the legacy application and when should I say, oh no, this is a cherished system. It's not legacy bad, it's legacy good, if you will, and we should keep it.
Yeah, it was interesting. I wanted to laugh when Stephanie said mainframe because, our county had mainframe systems, and I just want to slap my forehead up for a second.
I remember the data center with the mainframe.
Oh, it wasn't my data center. I don't want to say that, right?
Yeah.
I think the important aspect was that, it still stayed around, and we tried looking at every angle, see how we go about replacing a mainframe, and nothing took hold. So, and it was a robust system. It was, again, like Stephanie said, it's not loser type. It was a very robust system. I don't know of many people that can hack into mainframes anymore, or even understand the languages behind it. But the real concern really is, the training, the people involved with it, and the skill sets involved. What used to be COBOL and the rest of those programming skills are now Python, PHP, so more web development languages. So trying to find people with those skill sets it's definitely a requirement for you to build into where you want to go as a roadmap, right? So if you can't find someone who understands mainframes or COBOL, you have to say, okay, how much longer can I hold on to this? And is there even a way to outsource such a thing, right? Is it a benefit of mine to outsource these competencies to someone else who specializes in, while I looking into more a futuristic role, right? So the legacy applications role or bridging that gap, saying, can I virtualize these legacy applications? Is it even possible? Can I put into a container, Kubernetes container system, right? Is it possible to break up? So developing partnerships is pretty critical in trying to strategize on how your organizations want to take hold with future incoming applications versus the current operational stuff, right? And it's really hard to judge whether it's going to be disruptive or not. And at times it has to be disruptive, right? And that's part of the transformation and innovation platform is disruption itself in order to create a new sort of platform for and guide into which organizations can move forward into the future. And so one thing was also interesting, Shahid brought up, was that shadow IT, right? So I tend to think shadow IT it comes forward because there's a tendency for disagreements where some team members might not agree with what you're doing strategically, and they didn't have a voice for it, right? Back in 2016 or 2017, I forgot, Gartner gave out a great report called bimodal designs, right? So bimodal is basically two-way designs. One is sort of a strategic team of data transformers and people who really want to push the cutting edge technologies, while the other one's much more operational. And during that time frame, I found that pretty brilliant, actually. So I sort of broke my teams off into two groups. One was much more foundational as a group, where they sort of kept day-to-day lights on technology, made sure things were working and without disruption. And I made a smaller group, those who sort of volunteered and wanted to become the great transformers and push and drive innovation. And so that group was smaller, much smaller, but they drove hardcore innovation and brought more different technologies, such as cloud technologies or a new system. Office 365 was one of them. And so it was an interesting take because at that point, shadow IT didn't really, it came forward, right? It became light IT or anything else. And so when you think of transforming your teams, you think of those who want, and it's really the people aspect of it, those who really want to change, and give them something to do, because those are really the drivers of innovation. And there will be those who enjoys the foundational technology, the legacy applications, and they are really good at what they do, and give them that chance to say, hey, this is foundational to the organization. This is what we can bring to the table, and this is what we can do. And I don't want to talk about budgeting, because I think that's across the board for everybody, right? You don't really talk much about it because it's always in your radar and it's always a concern.
Yeah. And I want to get to the whole innovation side of things. I think we can get to that in a minute, but I think there's just so many practical things from an operational standpoint. In fact, I've heard CIOs say, the operational minutia is so overwhelming because there's so many things. And unlike other industries, with legacy applications, a true legacy application that maybe you're no longer using, often you have to maintain it, because regulations requires you to keep that data for 6 years or whatever it might be, right? So I think that's another element of this. I mean, what are the other measures that you see that you're like, okay, yeah, now it's time to sunset this application? Stephanie, what are your measures that you say, okay, when this is happening, I understand I need to sunset it. I need to push it to an archive, which, I mean, maybe that's a discussion to have as well. Do we have application archives, or, how are you approaching it? And what measures, do you say, okay, yeah, that's no longer useful for our organization?
So a couple of things. I mean, I think first we look at the vendor itself and where their support level is, right? I mean, if they're no longer providing any support, if we can't patch it, if we can't do updates to it, if we can't keep it safe and secure, it's probably time, no matter who wants to use it and who likes to use it and how voluminous that number is or how powerful those people are, it's creating more risk than it is creating advantage. So that's probably a key thing is how, how legacy or how archaic is the technology itself, and what risk is it posing to the organization. And then beyond that, I think the next layer is how many people are using it. What are they using it for? And is there an easy way for them to get that information if they really need it in another way? So, I mean, we've all been through EHR transitions and consolidations. This is always a great opportunity to be looking at your application stack and figuring out what are the pieces that we can, bring together and eliminate over time. I think, so it's talking about that in advance and even creating some schedule to it. So you can say to people, in 10 months, this thing's going away. And so we need to start working through what those processes are. But, we've had a few systems where we shut them down earlier because we were monitoring utilization and no one was getting into them. And so in fact, in one instance, I said, just shut it off. Let's see what happens. If somebody comes back and says, hey, I really need
then
that,
we'll turn it back on.
We'll have a conversation. But guess what? That didn't happen. So, I think probably those are, if we're really talking about legacy things where we've already really replaced that tech with something new, but for a myriad of reasons it's held on, then I think it's, are there other ways to do the work? Did we truly migrate everything? Who's still using it, and is of significant enough value that we're going to continue to support it? And then again, very central to the conversation is, where is it from a support, more like, from a security perspective and risk perspective. And if that answer, says it needs to go, then it goes.
Do you have a formal process for this? I mean, it's interesting you said, hey, we use the EHR to be able to do that, right? Because I mean, it reminds me of I think it was the CTO of HHS who said, we're really great at creating regulations, but we're really bad at getting rid of them. It kind of feels like the same thing. We're really great at implementing applications and really bad at getting rid of them. Is that the same?
No, I mean, application rationalization is something that we all need to be doing work on. And none of us, I think, have it dialed in, because it's an easy thing to let it go. When your plates are full of a whole bunch of other active things that have to be addressed right now, that 2-hour meeting that you were going to have looking through application utilization and whatever, it's like, well, that can wait till next month. That can wait till next month. And so, so you don't do it. I would say that I am looking at and probably want a partnership relationship with an organization. I know some of the archiving companies are now getting into this space, because in order to be able to archive it, they understand really the inner workings of a lot of these systems. And so, working with them to come in and actually help me create an assessment, create a scoring, so that we can have a conversation around, here's where this plays out in a scorecard, and therefore, where we can go with taking it offline. And this is easier and easier because there are a lot of newer technologies that allow us to take some of the data we may still need from those systems and leverage the data without having to keep the server spinning, so to speak. And so, it's a great time to be looking at it, but I'd be lying if I said that we're, meeting on this quarterly and systematically doing it, but it is a goal.
It's amazing no one wants to sign up for the decommissioning committee, otherwise known as the piss someone off because they really love that old legacy application committee, right? Like, that makes sense, right? Shahid, anything you'd add? What are the things you see, and how should people approach this?
Yeah, I think it's generally a never-ending battle. So I almost look at this as a reorganization problem rather than a application rationalization problem. And in this way is the next generation of IT, as we look over the next 10, 15, 20 years, what should be different is that we say we are in the decentralized execution and decentralized decision-making, but centralized governance. So say, for example, that we have a very few, but very specific things that the IT is involved in. Number one, identity systems, right? What is the single sign-on, identity and access management, privilege management, et cetera? We have to centralize that from a governance as well as an implementation perspective. It could be potentially backup and archiving. It could be potentially areas where we need to know from a governance perspective what all the metadata is across all these systems. So we have to go to IT and say, look, let's move to centralized governance and then decentralize all decision-making going forward. So basically, we're formalizing shadow IT. As you formalize this, I think Jeffrey gave a great example of the bimodal, which is look to see what is slow and rarely changing: identity and access management. It cannot be rapidly changing identity and access management. So we try to say, okay, combine those as little as possible, and then try, and this is where it's really hard, is how do you take some of those centralized IT dollars and move them into decentralized decision-making capabilities? If it's possible, and this is a big, big if it's possible to do centralized governance with decentralized decision-making and execution, then you have to distribute dollars to those decision makers and reduce the overall footprint of centralized IT to then move to the brilliant thing that Stephanie talked about, was orchestration. That is another centralized IT job, which is, just like I manage your identity and access management, I will give you the tools that safely and securely help you connect the dots between your app here and my app there. As you start to look at orchestration, then now you can say, look, I don't know about legacy or not legacy. I mean, it's a argument that is going to continue over time. The question is it legacy that I have to manage, or is it legacy that I can push to someone else? Now, this is pretty modernized, and you have to think about what this looks like over the next 5 or 10 years. But I don't know that there is a way to do centralized IT with the explosion of more and more software coming in, where we don't just move to a decentralized model of execution and decision making. And that's where I think when you look at these kinds of scorecards, I think the scorecards make a ton of sense. But then the question is, are you scoring it with a centralized IT or a decentralized IT model? So I'd love to hear, Stephanie and Jeffrey's thoughts on what can we do to the organization? Because if you can innovate the organization, the innovation of other things becomes easier. But if your organization looks like it did 15 years ago and you're trying to do new things, that's going to be tough.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear, Stephanie, what you think. I think a lot of CIOs would say, no, that's scary, Shahid. I'm not ready to do that. Like, what do you think, Stephanie?
I mean, I think that's our job. I think actually most of the great CIOs that I know are saying, yes, we're game for that now, right? We don't want to be just I mean, as a physician CIO, I'm not in this role to just have us keep doing things the way we've always been doing them. I'm in this role to be innovative and think differently and think about operations and operational problems and strategies and goals of the organization and try and figure out how best to leverage technology to get us there. And so if I completely agree with what Shahid is saying, but I still am going to contend that you can be doing that and making the best of some legacy systems. And in fact, I might even contend you're going to have to make do with some legacy systems because you're going to be innovating on one branch and other things are just going to have to sit for a little bit. And so it gets back to that piece around what's the business need we're trying to solve, and what are we going to do that?
Yeah. Jeffrey, what would you add to that? I mean, because I think it is interesting that there's risks in keeping your old legacy systems. There's risks in implementing new ones too, right? I mean, so there's risk and costs associated with both. And how do you balance that, right? To Stephanie's original question, how do we balance this?
I think it takes a lot of courage, right? And especially from leadership, let's say, leadership who wants to innovate. And when it comes down to it, when it's your time to make that decision, you just hit it and go, right? You did your due diligence. You spoke to a lot of partners. You've aligned with a lot of colleagues who's talks about you. So you do as much work as possible, but it's all in the action, right? So it takes a courageous heart to do digital transformation. And in some ways, it's kind of funny because COVID sort of brought that to the forefront, right? Those who were just waiting for that time to implement VDI or work from home or Zoom or anything, you were sort of forced to do that. It took a global pandemic to do that to us. But I think
courage a little easier.
It is it's like liquid courage, right? And in many ways, I think that was a start. It was a very large spark that forced the entire industry to not only move forward, but think about ways to innovate, because it's almost like I took it as a freedom package. Right? Here you go. You are free to do what is necessary to get the job done and do it right. And in the healthcare industry, Stephanie knows that we are there for our doctors, nurses, and our patients ultimately, right? And I really believe that a lot of people in the healthcare industry does it because they do it for a purpose, to help those in need. And us in IT, previously, that was our job. We provided those solutions and we helped people push those solutions. And as long as you keep that in mind, I think you can build up the courage to innovate and push the agenda, so that it's never all about, what's the newest application, what's cool, what's not. And there, those aspects, I like the cool stuff too, right? That's sort of why you like IT. But there's also the end game where, can I help my patients, get medicine? How fast can it be processed? Can I get my doctors and nurses to not have to type this whole thing in one click and memorize 30 different passwords with 18 different characters? So that innovation aspect really comes from empathy towards others.
Yeah, and John, if I can add one thing, Jeffrey won't talk about it because he's too kind about Dell, but one area where Dell is actually pretty strong, especially with the VMware capabilities, is it's our job, as I mentioned, to take care of certain things in the IT group, identity, orchestration, et cetera. But the best of the best know that these legacy systems are going to live for a while. And if it's not legacy on-prem, it might be legacy cloud, and we can leave that for a side. But you should be spending real dollars today establishing your VDI, your virtual desktop infrastructure, establishing your virtualization environment, so that as things become legacy on older operating systems, you have a place to sit them in. And I think that's really where, when you say, well, what can the IT department do? One, innovate the organization and say, long-term, we're going to move more and more self-service. Our job will be identity and orchestration, et cetera. But it's also our job for anything that is on-prem, sitting in our data centers, to give you a place where the expense of maintaining legacy. I mean, one of the reasons mainframes sit around for a long time is because they have a very long shelf life, right? They've got multiple decades shelf lives because they have replaceable components. You can actually take the mainframe and then replace hardware inside it live while the thing is on. That capability of maintaining and managing legacy in terms of hardware is what we need to think about with software. And so, you've got Dell and VMware and others that, you can think of and say, well, if we took 5% of our budget, 2% of our budget, and just make sure that we have a good, solid virtualization environment, it means that when our hardware dies, I mean, at some point, each of these pieces of hardware are going to die. The question is, do you replace the hardware and the software? Or can you virtualize the hardware and put the software onto these systems? So the more you look at over time and say, okay, over the next 18, 24, 36, 48 months, all of our infrastructure is getting more and more virtualized. Now you are removing yourself from the downside impact of retaining something. There's still the other impacts of training, are the security patches there, et cetera. But there's a legacy part that you could start to create a much better infrastructure for, so that you are more isolated from the downside problems of hardware replacement and those kind of areas. Jeffrey, you're welcome to chime in because you know that area better than I do. But
yeah, you're being kind
does
about that. So thank you. Yeah, that Dell and VMware, we definitely have those kind of aspects. And again, I think it's trying to build up the partnership in relation to what you're trying to innovate, right? So getting good partners, it's so critical. And I've, for one, have always depended on either good relationship with my partners or my colleagues, where I get good feedback from them. I mean, we're all in the same boat, right? And we deal with good and bad partners out there, and we deal with good and bad hardware, software, right? So in that aspect, we try to say, okay, what's the best, best for us, price versus performance, bang for buck, and how are we being supported throughout this integration of transforming my organization?
Stephanie, were you trying to chime in too?
Well, I mean, the other, I guess, a thing that came to my mind is, because we're a relatively heavily virtualized environment, but as I think about legacy and legacy applications, I mean, in healthcare, there are a number of applications that are difficult, if not impossible, to put into our virtualized environment. I mean, getting them app stacked and in there, like there are certain things where we just say, nope, that can't go in there. Once in a while, that's a driver, back to, well, what would cause you to say, well, we're not going to use that system anymore? That is occasionally a piece that will make us say, well, gosh, if we can't even put this into our VDI environment, maybe it's not something we should be using anymore. That's not as common as probably some of those other pieces. So while I don't disagree philosophically, I mean, the reality is, while we're living in both of these worlds, that's a nice idea to be thinking about. But some of the software and medical device companies in particular, and some of these other folks that we work with, have not brought their even legacy stuff far enough forward for us to be able to leverage some of these kinds of tools.
Yeah, and I would Garner say, I try to look at it as, what's the lowest hanging fruit, especially with legacy stuff with them. What's the easiest thing to do with them? Well, typically it's just replace the hardware, right? Buy new hardware, shift them into new hardware, and bam, you have hopefully 5 more years or something, right? So it's a consideration, definitely, right? Versus, okay, these guys don't support virtualization, they don't support anything out of Server 2003. So what I do with this, and I've had moments where you get so upset that you say, okay, let's just try to do it, and then, oh, we're not going to be supported, and so let's go backwards, right? And so what's the lowest hanging fruit for you guys, right? Typically hardware change out for me would be lowest hanging fruit, just because it's like for like, typically like for like, better hardware. But moving forward, it's always about, I think it's more about, well, who's supporting it? Is it SaaS based? Is it a cloud based system? do I have to deal with hardware anymore, right? So that is a very big consideration. Stephanie, I saw you want to say something.
Well, so I've been thinking in this last couple of minutes, I mean, it'll be interesting to have this conversation maybe in 5 to 7 years, because honestly, I think one of the things that's going to get us out of this legacy challenge is software as a service. The reason we even have an option to keep some of these systems around is because we're willing to continue to have the people who, write in those languages and support that hardware and cobble it together and order parts off of eBay and whatever it might be in order to keep things going. But as we move things to software as a service models, the reality is the vendor is sort of the one telling us like, hey, I'm putting you on notice. As of X date, this is not supported and you can't have it anymore. And we'll, and then it's more about archiving and data migration and things like that. But you're not really talking anymore about having to technologically support a system or even having to arm wrestle with those end users who are like, but I really need that. It's easy. I can be like, the vendor's taking it away. We'll try and find a great place to put that data and make it accessible, if in fact that's the right thing to do. But again, I actually think that software as a service and moving a lot of our, any other, cloud-based things, as we move things into the cloud, it's going to change the dynamic of this a little bit. But software as a service for sure changes who's in control of this. And the funny thing is, we've had those situations happen. Everybody's fine. Everybody survived,
Yep.
So we know we can take them away and it will all work out in the end. It's not always ideal, but I do think this is going to be a changing conversation. And one thing I did put in the Q&A chat, as far as, well, what about just the legacy data itself and archiving and where does it go and whatever? The first thing I would say is I think most of us keep way too much stuff. From a clinical perspective, I am a huge proponent of, as soon as it's not legally required anymore, get rid of it. Because from a medical legal perspective, if we're going to keep it and say that it's accessible, I'm now responsible for it clinically. But if it's 17 clicks and a deep dive away, what's the likelihood that while I'm doing patient care, I'm going to go and dig that out? So we might have a physician that says, oh my gosh, I really need that report though from, 1997 when we did their original, cardiac, surgery. Well, I mean, do you actually need the report, or do you need some of the salient elements that are over the test of time we need to know? And can we build that into newer documentation that's more accessible and things like that? Because the likelihood that you really need the operative report from that day is pretty low. There are a few scenarios where, once in a while there's a crazy story where that really did come in handy. Yeah. But it does not surpass that 80-20 rule at all. And it's very difficult as we transition systems for us to continue to keep moving this data from place to place or putting it in archives and tying them in and asking people to try and go in and look for it. So I think it's a lot more important in this era of wanting to leverage data to make good decisions and be a learning healthcare organization for us to capture the metadata elements, the discrete data elements that can be things that can be, put in data warehouses and captured in reporting and things like that. And then sort of take some of the other stuff that's more, the traditional clinical work product. And when we don't need those records anymore, let's not keep those records anymore, because you're really actually saddling your clinicians with more burden and maybe not giving them the best tools to leverage it.
And Stephanie, what do you think about the distinction between that structured archiving versus unstructured archiving? So for example, PDF-A, which is the standard for PDF for long-term, it's got a guarantee of like 100 plus years. Would you suggest people, when they do archiving, to just move to PDF-A so they can use any file system, long-term storage, like on AWS? If you use AWS's long-term archiving, it's almost like 1/20th the price of the short-term archiving versus the structured. How would you distinguish those two?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't want anything around for 100 years. Let's just be clear.
It should be gone in 6 in most states.
Yeah, exactly. Or 18 if you're talking about kids.
Right. Oh, sorry, Stephanie, I meant that the PDF-A archive format, it's available so that you don't need any third-party systems. You can use a built-in system like Microsoft Office or anything.
Yes. And honestly, that's kind of what we did, is because our archive is kind of home built. And you know, I think it depends how accessible the information in it really needs to be. As of right now, I don't know that the Amazons of the world have spent a lot of time creating tools that allow me to go dig through that very easily, as they spend time and effort on doing that and make it easy for me to take what is a giant pile of PDFs and make some sense of it, or dig into it and get what I need, then that might be a good strategy. But I think right now that's the part that keeps us from wanting to go robustly down that road, is it's not just a matter of it being there and being easy to grab in any kind of system, but once there's a huge volume of stuff in there, I need to be able to get exactly what I need to get, nothing more, nothing less, and it needs to be fast. And those tools are still somewhat challenging.
That's right. And if I could, Jeffrey, I was just curious, when you look at the broader non-healthcare world, I mean, that's one nice thing about Dell and VMware, you guys see lots of other industries. I get the sense that, like when I give advice to colleagues like Stephanie, I always say, try not to use healthcare specific technologies to do your archiving, because the healthcare specific narrow guys are not going to be around 20 years from now, 30, 40 years from now. And the archive question is not does the data need to last more than 7 years? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, does the format have the ability to be read? Like we are now in the 50th decade of IT systems. There were things that were created in the 1970s, which we should still be able to open and see today. And that's what the PDF-A, CSV. So what I would almost recommend is have a strategy. If you have a good archiving strategy, it makes your legacy migration strategy much, much easier. If you have no archiving strategy, like a very sophisticated one, my argument or my thesis is, if you go to PDF-A and CSV, just take these two formats. If you do that, you have an enormous amount of capabilities to buy the ability to search, index, store, archive, et cetera, those formats in a variety of ways, and has nothing to do with healthcare. It can be done in completely non-healthcare specific ways. If you go to an archiving solution, which is healthcare specific, well, now you're going to have to wonder, if it's healthcare specific, will this company that I'm going to be using for archiving for all of my systems be around long-term or not? I'd just love to hear, what Jeffrey and team are doing over at Dell.
Ideally, I think the backup strategies are pretty general, right? And it's backup and then archive, right? So I don't think that's changed too much. But the initiatives that you sort of create for your backup strategy, who you select as a partner is pretty important, right? And then you go about saying, okay, I want the critical aspects of these applications backed up into a VM or CSV or everything like that, right? And then you also have to look into the technologies themselves, right? How do you want to archive? Do you do something like a Dell Avamar system or a data domain, which is fantastic? Does it deduplicate, right? What's the deduplication rate, right? So that you can hold more with a lot less, right? And then it goes to Stephanie's idea. It's like, well, how long do I hold this for? Do I hold it for 6 months? And so you could actually compare the metrics against that information and say, okay, well, the majority, 99% of people only use up to 6 months, right? And after 6 months, 1 or 2% really do. And the further down you go, right, the further down the age you go, the less it's utilized, right? So you can say, okay, after 2 years, I can actually cold storage this thing, so it's less expensive, either to Dell Apex system or AWS or someone, right? Or even your local tape drives, right? And we all know that tape has been around forever. I've been trying to kill it off myself many times, but it just stays there, right? And the problem with tape is, it gets old. What format do you use? LTO? Does it even work anymore? If I recover it, is 50% gone? I don't know what happens, right? So that's where a cloud strategy for you might make more sense, because you can probably recover it. Of course, extracting a huge amount might cost you a pretty penny. So that has to come into your budgeting requirements, right? Again, I think it's important for people to understand the strategy they want to take, whether it's archiving, whether it's production systems, or whether it's a SaaS provider that you want to look into. So how do you go about controlling the narrative and the aspect of your own data, right? And a lot of healthcare providers say, I want to control my data. I don't want other people to control my data, right? I think finance would be the same thing. They would want to control their data, right? So I know a lot of companies are trying to just cover all aspects, whether it's finance, regulatory, healthcare regulatory. They're just getting compliance with like 30 different certifications every single time. And we're doing the same thing. We're trying to certify as much as possible. And it comes down to, well, is this really what you guys want when it comes to a strategy of backup orchestration, automation? And I think one of the things we don't really have time for is the soft costs of transforming your organization to human costs, right? Are your people capable of transforming the skill sets? And I think it's very important to develop that, right? Can they use a new cloud system? Do they know how to utilize it, right? We can't just say, okay, cloud and let's go, right? It might not be the right way to strategize in transforming your people from a mainframe group to a server shop. And it's also important that these technology waves come like this, right? It's centralized, decentralized, centralized, and I think we're sort of approaching the decentralized phase where everybody's work from home, work from everywhere, do everything over there, right? And it's being pushed more towards the edge by, I think, a lot of consumers, really. Consumers are pushing things more decentralized towards the edge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would disagree with you on one point, Shahid, as far as the healthcare specific archiving companies. Certainly they have their advantages and disadvantages, right? And the question of long-term viability is a good one to ask them, right? So that's, but to Stephanie's point, maybe that's only 6 years and then you're going to get rid of it anyways, right? Or whatever, 18 if they're kids, right? So, but I would say, what you described was the archiving strategy when you don't really need access to the data, or at least ready access to the data. Your strategy can work for many of those solutions where you're just trying to do it for compliance because I have to retain it and so I need it, but I'm never going to access it, or almost never, maybe an HIM person every once in a while, right? Whereas many of the healthcare specific archiving companies, they're archiving things like accounts receivable, where it's like, I need to actively continue to work these. That doesn't work in all those other systems, right? And so I think there's a play here, right, for both. And to me, the question is, how active do you need access to that data? And that's where the healthcare archiving companies do a really good job. And in fact, in most cases, they're usually a conversion company too. So they'll often put it into the EHR and the other half in the archive because they know what really matters. So I think that's the only nuance I'd offer.
Yeah.
As far as which companies you use.
Yeah. The only, so you're exactly right about that. Maybe a better way to say what I was saying now that you clarified is, you want to use the humans that are very healthcare specific, right? They understand these technologies, the techniques and what to do, but your technology itself should be neutral, right? So this is where you use, whether it's the Dells of the world or anyone else who has these capabilities, you use these because they're industry neutral and they will be innovated on much, much faster. But the service providers, and that, you heard Stephanie and Jeffrey both with enormous amounts of experience talk about get the partner right. Well, the right partner for healthcare is the humans that understand healthcare and the technology that is neutral, because there's a lot more users, it's cheaper, and because there are a lot more users. But you're exactly right. You don't want to just trust your archiving of actual systems to people who don't really know healthcare. That's exactly right.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we're right at the end here. Jeffrey, any final thoughts on this idea? I mean, I think I'd love to hear maybe a final thought too on how do you balance the legacy versus continuing innovation? Want to wrap us up?
Yeah, it's a fine line. Again, we want to make sure that balance continues to innovate. I don't think innovation ever stops, right? Inside, you're combining and you're extracting a lot of stuff out of the technology realm, saying what's best for my organization, right? And at the same time, you're trying to move what's old forward, right? And I don't think I don't think it has to be in constant battle with each other. I don't see it as I think you should have a partnership, right? A partnership of your own teams, that they are great partners. They know exactly what you need. Partnership of your staff, leadership, the CMIOs, the CIOs of the world, who wants to make sure that they're going in the right path, and making sure that you have good advisors. Partnerships like Dell Technology, where the providers speak to a lot of different colleagues. They speak to a lot of different industries. Someone who brings a huge amount of resources and say, okay, we see the entire industry heading towards this direction. And then you can make your decision based on that context, right? What always concerns me is whenever people chase the new shiny thing, right? What's the new shiny thing? Or cloud computing was the new shiny. Let's go all in, right? And it's not to say it wasn't the right call for them, but I think when you chase something without a good strategic goal and a plan for it, it tends to be hit or miss, 50-50, right? What we're trying to do is enable people to say, okay, we're very certain this is the goal, and the time horizon is 3 years. And we want to make sure that these legacy applications can stay. It's being supported appropriately by this amount of people. But this entire group right here, we want to push forward with data transformation and orchestration and SaaS cloud providers, because one, we're trying to, obviously cut the budget a little bit because we're trying to save on money. Two, we're trying to push an agenda that provides better health outcomes for our population. And three, we're trying to make things easier so that our teams and the nurses and the administrative staff can get what they need as quick as they need, right? Without being encumbered by, again, 300 passwords, 50 different, facial IDs, biometrics, this log on, that log on, and 50 different applications that does a little bit of something that might be good or not, right?
Yeah.
So
That's great.
that overall strategic goal is pretty critical. And I think I would say speak to your staff about it, because they know what's best.
Yeah. I would summarize it as be intentional, not emotional, which that's what strategy is all about. So thanks so much to all of our panelists, and thanks everyone that watched live. We appreciate Dell Technologies for sponsoring this event, and we'll be sending out the recording for those that missed it and want to check it out. And a big thank you to all of you. We'll hope you have a great day.
Thanks. Take care, everybody.
Thank you so much, Kevin.